All right, this marks the first of 2 weeks where we'll be covering social psychology. Today we're going to be focusing on the way that our behavior is influenced by the presence of others and how we interact in groups. So one of the first things that I want you to consider is how the presence of others is going to influence your performance. So consider that you had to do some type of maybe patient assessment procedure, and it was the first time where you were actually demonstrating it all the way through, and it was in front of maybe a group of your peers as well as your preceptor. And so this is something that is highly complex, also something where you don't yet have a lot of skill. So in that case, if we're talking about a situation where basically you're in over your head, or it's a little bit challenging, well then, as I'm sure you can attest, the presence of others is going to hurt your performance. Let's think about why that might be. Presumably, this is something where you have to use a lot of your cognitive resources. You're having to really think about everything that you're doing. So this is the type of task, since I said you're in over your head or almost, it's really occupying all of your thoughts. Or at least it should. But when you have this authority figure, your peers, you don't want to embarrass yourself, you don't want to look bad, that stress is going to also occupy some of your cognitive resources. And so instead of being able to devote everything to thinking about your patient assessment, you're also thinking about, oh God, am I doing this right? I'm screwing up. What is she thinking about me? And that's going to hurt your performance. Now compare that to a situation where maybe the task is still highly complex, like playing a really skilled soccer match, but the performer in this case is highly skilled. So this is actually one of the female U.S. soccer team members. So we're going to assume that she's pretty highly skilled. Now in that case, when we are highly skilled, this is something that doesn't actually need to occupy all of our mental resources. In fact, in some cases, if we're highly skilled, if we think too hard about it, we choke. We overthink it and we perform poorly. Now in this case, when we have really high skill, or in other cases, if maybe we're not especially skilled, but the task is not very complex, if we are not in over our heads and we are perfectly well equipped to do the task, then we actually see something known as social facilitation. Social facilitation is where we will actually perform better in the presence of others than we would alone. So again, when we are well matched with the task, either it's not very complex or we are highly skilled, then the presence of others kind of takes us outside of our heads and allows us to do what we do best without overthinking it, and having other people around actually will facilitate or help our performance. And so that's social facilitation. All right, on to a new topic, and that's thinking about how we behave in groups. So I pose this question for you to ponder. In which of those two circumstances do you think you would put forth more effort? A larger group with a larger paper, or a smaller group with a smaller paper? And I want you to notice that the pages per person is basically equal on these two. However, what we see in both research and probably what you've seen in your personal experience is that people tend to put forth a lot more effort when we have a small group than we have a really large group. So one of the discussion board questions asks you to consider why this might be. Why is it that when we are in groups, we exhibit a phenomenon known as social loafing? And it's basically that we are loafing. We're pulling on a few stronger members in the group to do the job for everybody. And the reason why I have this NPR image up there is because a classic example for social loafing is the NPR pledge drive. Now, I recognize that maybe a lot of you don't listen to NPR. I do. Certainly a lot of Americans do. But most of us are loafing. Most of us don't pay any money for NPR, and we rely on a few people to do the right thing, to send in their pledges, so that everybody else can enjoy NPR. And certainly there are a number of examples of social loafing in our environment One of the things I will ask you to consider, one of the essay questions, is to consider an example of social loafing in your own experience. But for the discussion board, one of the things I want you to think about is, why do people put forth less effort in larger groups? And then also to try and think about what could professors or managers do to try to limit social loafing when people are working in groups. To give you some maybe hints, research tells us that there are certain factors that will limit social loafing. One of those things is a person's gender and a person's culture. We know that when people are more collectivist in their approach, it's more about the common good, and so we see less social loafing. If I feel really responsible for you because that's my cultural upbringing, I'm probably not going to loaf. So we see that both with people who live in collectivist cultures and also more so among women than in men, because women tend to exhibit more of this cooperative, collectivist nature. So less loafing among women, less loafing among collectivist folks. We also see certain personality factors. So we didn't really talk about personality this semester, but there are some particular traits. So if people are highly conscientious, this is no surprise. The people who are always getting their work done early, doing a great job, really taking it seriously, you can count on those folks to not loaf. We also see that people are highly agreeable. The folks who want to get along with everybody, who want to look good in front of everybody, they're not likely to loaf either, because of course then they're going to piss people off, and they're agreeable. They don't want to do that. The final thing also has to do with the nature of the group. How well does the group know each other? If I know you really well and I consider you to be a friend, I'm not going to loaf because I don't want to let you down. And actually, kind of the discussion board question is asking you to consider some other group factors. So I'm not going to say any more about that, but I certainly will tune into the discussion board and see what sorts of answers people are coming up with. Another thing to keep in mind in terms of how a group will impact us is that although we'd like to think that we are unique and that we are individual thinkers, the reality is our opinions about things are heavily shaped by the folks around us and the people that we're talking to. So to give you an example, and you have probably experienced this, I think the school shuttle is notorious for this little phenomenon of group polarization. But let's say you're a bit frustrated about an assignment, and you talk to other people who are also a bit frustrated. How do you think that conversation might affect your opinion? Do you think you're going to come away from it feeling less frustrated? Do you think your opinion won't change at all? After all, they basically feel the same way you do. Or do you think you'd come away feeling even more frustrated? That conversation is going to make you even angrier. Well, what the research tells us, and quite frankly what my observations on the school shuttle confirm for me, is this phenomenon of group polarization. So you start out and you're feeling fairly neutral about something, or maybe you're even just a little bit frustrated. And then you start talking with your friends or your colleagues, your coworkers, and what start out is just well, this kind of annoys me, and then somebody else says, yeah, that really annoys me too, and somebody else chimes in and says, yeah, that is really wrong. And basically what happens is one little opinion gets magnified until you leave the conversation feeling like this, really angry. And this occurs not just in the negative realm, it can also actually happen in the positive realm too. So if you get people who are feeling positively about something, get them talking about it, they're going to feel even more strongly. So that's polarization, where talking in a group actually polarizes your opinion or moves it more towards the extreme. So you go from the kind of neutral phase of this guy here, talk to people, into a more extreme or polarized emotion. Now, when we are in groups, this is also going to affect our decision making. There's a classic expression, that 2 heads are better than 1. Stands to reason that maybe 5 heads would be better than 1 or 2. And sometimes that can be true. But we also have seen many cases of a phenomenon known as group think. And what happens with group think is that when people are in a group, there's a desire to reach consensus, a desire for everybody to agree. And what can happen, often because of some peer pressure, some desires for conformity, what ends up happening is that people stop being critical and doing a good analysis of the ideas. And so this analysis gets squashed, quality ideas get squashed, and we end up with the consensus being of a lower quality than it would have been if we had just analyzed all the ideas. So again, groupthink refers to the phenomenon of failing to critically evaluate ideas because you're trying to reach consensus or because you want unanimity. All right, this would be a great time to pause this video and go over and look at the video dedicated to the Challenger explosion and how groupthink actually led to NASA's decision to launch the Challenger despite the fact that it was really too cold for the equipment to hold, and indeed the experts' worst prediction actually came true, as depicted in this image down there. Now, one of the things that this video gets into is the circumstances that can lead groupthink to be more likely to occur. And one of the big things is whenever group cohesiveness is really emphasized, that we all have to get along, we all have to come up with the same idea. Another big factor that makes groupthink more likely is if you have a really strong leader that makes his or her opinion known, because then, of course, the other people who are in the group feel compelled to fall in line with what that group leader is arguing for. Another factor is if in the group you have people who are highly similar to one another, who really want to please one another, who are coming from similar backgrounds, there is greater pressure to conform, and so we're more likely to see groupthink. And also, certainly something that was a factor with the Challenger explosion is groupthink is more likely when you're under a time pressure, when there's a lot of stress, because then, of course, you want to come up with an opinion right away, and so you don't feel like you have time to critically evaluate the ideas. Now, an important question is how can we actually prevent groupthink? So this is basically taking those circumstances where it's more likely to happen and turning those around. One thing that can be very useful is if the leader makes herself absent, or if he fails to speak up. And so that way everybody else that's in the group feels a little bit freer to let their ideas be known, because they're not just trying to please the leader. Something that a good leader might also do, whether or not he or she is in the room, would be to set up a devil's advocate. So if I'm the leader of the group, I might tell somebody in that small group, I want you to just disagree with me. Whatever I say, I don't want you to go along. I want you to disagree with me. And what happens is when you have that devil's advocate who's disagreeing with the leader, it allows other people to feel more comfortable with disagreeing as well. Another thing is you can form smaller subgroups. By forming subgroups, it reduces that pressure to conform. There's less pressure when you have maybe 1 or 2 group partners than if you have, let's say, 8 or 9 group partners. And certainly another good thing would be to consult outside experts who have no real need to please the group. They're just there to give you your opinion or give you their opinion. So there are other suggestions, but these are some of the big ones that have been offered by consultants as a way to reduce groupthink. A common thing that can emerge when we are in groups is the phenomenon of de-individuation, where we lose our sense of self, we lose our own identity, and essentially go along with mob mentality, basically. And I hesitated to say mob mentality because de-individuation is not always a bad thing. So you can see I have the pictures of some military folks here. And one of the big goals of basic training or boot camp with different military branches is to try and break down one's sense of individuality. And so the entire goal is de-individuation. And the idea is that we need to break down a person's own sense of individualism. We need a person to be thinking about the group as a whole. And in the case of the military, that is a good thing, where you lose the focus on what's important for me, what does my inner guidance tell me, and think just about what the group is seeking. So it can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing. So over here, this is a picture of the riots that happened the night that Joe Paterno, that's right, that Joe Paterno was fired from Penn State. And that night, if you recall, there was a significant amount of rioting that was happening in State College. And so again, when we are in large groups, we lose our sense of individual values, our own individual moral compass, and basically succumb to the morality, or lack thereof, that the group exhibits. A final place where we can commonly see de-individuation would be wherever we are on the internet and we're free to make comments. So this could be on Facebook or on YouTube or on any sort of blog where you're free to make comments and nobody can see who you are. You may not even have your real name. You may just have a screen name. You don't have to have necessarily your picture up there. And so those factors are taking away your individual identity. And I would bet you have seen comments from people that were just horribly nasty. You may have been guilty of making comments in one of these venues that you would never, ever, ever make to somebody in person. But when we're on the internet, we lose that individual identity and kind of go with the push of the group. And sometimes the internet's morality tends to be pretty low level and pretty nasty. And so de-individuation, definitely one of the problems, again, is that we sacrifice our own moral guidance and go with the group. And often that group morality is not very good. Of course, the benefits, as we see in the military, is that we sacrifice that individual identity to do something for the good of a group that can be very valuable. One of the things that we see with de-individuation is when your individual guilt, your individual identity can't be determined, we often feel freer to do things that we wouldn't otherwise do. Now, I have this little question for you, and I'm not going to ask you to post this on the discussion board. I encourage you to maybe consider it as a dinner table topic or going out with your friends or on a date or something, maybe to talk about this. You can have some interesting answers. But it gets at the heart of what would you do if nobody would know that you did it? So it kind of gets into the issue of de-individuation. I'll tell you that when I do post this to students in class, I get some pretty common themes. It's very common that people are interested in cheating. Some people talk about wanting to go in and change grades. Stealing is quite common. I have actually had a couple people say commit murder. Let's say there's somebody who's been really bothering them. Most people, when given this option to do something and nobody would know that you did it, we tend to do bad things. Now this reveals a little bit of something about our moral compass. It reminds us that one of the big factors that keeps our behavior in check is that we know that other people are watching after us. So I know that if I steal, I'm going to get in trouble with the law. I'm also probably going to be somewhat of a social outcast. I'm going to disappoint my friends, disappoint my parents. Kind of getting back to this issue that emotions and guilt do a really good job of keeping us in line. Well, our social status and our group membership also do a really good job of keeping us in line. Now, if we're not worried about people finding out, we can tend to do pretty naughty things. And speaking of naughty things, I want to move on to the Stanford Prison Experiment. This is one of the most famous psychology experiments out there. I do have a video. It's about 30 minutes, so you might want to pop up some popcorn and sit and watch. I'm not really going to say too much about it here. I want you to watch the video. There's a couple discussions of it in the textbook, and then one of your discussion board questions relates to the Stanford Prison Experiment, and one of your test essay questions relates to it as well. So definitely something that you want to spend a little bit of time thinking about. Maybe look at that essay question, start sketching out ideas. Okay, so take a break now. I encourage you to do that and watch the video and then come back. Certainly a big mechanism that is operating in the Stanford Prison Experiment, that's operating in groupthink, that's operating in a whole host of behaviors that we perform when we are in a group, is conformity. And one of my favorite experiments related to conformity has to do with this smoky room. I couldn't really get a good image of a smoky room, but that's what that's supposed to be. And in this experiment, there were people assigned to one of two conditions. And in both conditions, people were sitting and just filling out a survey. that took about 10 minutes to complete. In the one condition, they were filling out the survey in a room all by themselves. In the other condition, they were filling it out in a room of about 15 people. Now, in both conditions, within a few minutes after they started filling out the survey, the room started to fill with smoke. Smoke was coming in through the vents. And what the experimenters were interested in seeing is how long did it take the people to first notice that there was smoke and then to actually get up and walk out because of the danger that the smoke posed. Now, in which case do you think it took people longer to get up out of the room? Do you think it took them longer when they were by themselves or when they were in the group? Well, hopefully you chose group. What we saw was that when people were by themselves, they would typically get up and walk out within under a minute. However, when they were in the group, it took about 4 to 5 minutes before they actually would get up and walk out of the room. And there are some factors in terms of maybe just not noticing that it was smoky. When we're in a group, we tend to not look at people. We tend to keep our heads down, so maybe people just took longer to even notice. But researchers definitely believe that there was certainly some conformity going on. And so this brings me to these two other boxes that I have. With the informational social influence, this is this thing where we think other people know better. So if I'm sitting there in that smoky room, I can see there's smoke, but nobody else seems to be alarmed. I might start trying to rationalize the situation and just assume, oh, other people must know something that I don't know. Maybe they realize that this is just water vapor, or maybe there's somebody trying out some kind of smoke machine next door, and that's what's sending in the smoke. I don't know, but nobody else seems to be alarmed, so I'm not going to be alarmed either. Probably everybody else knows better than I do. That's the idea of informational social influence, and I'm sure that was one of the factors that were governing their behavior. However, there's also the factor of normative social influences, and this is just where we want other people to like us, and we want to avoid being excluded. Even when we're in among strangers, we still want those strangers to like us and not think that we're weirdos. So I'm sitting there in that smoky room. I know that there is a problem, but I don't want to look like some fool. I don't want to look like a crazy person who goes, oh my God, there's smoke in the room, everybody out, out, out. And so I will just sit there because I don't want these other people to think that I'm a weirdo, which seems like really a weird reason to potentially sacrifice your life. And yet, that's what folks were doing. I also have one other video that I want you to watch. It's more amusing. It's a little elevator experiment that Candid Camera put on. Kind of demonstrates a little bit of conformity, some non-spoken peer pressure. So I want you to consider these and then go ahead and move on to the next video.